Hello and welcome once again to Bible Class Topics. We're continuing our study of the Gospel of Matthew. Today we begin Matthew chapter 12, looking at the first 29 verses. This is part one of two parts. Here's the overall outline of our study. We've already studied the coming of the King in the first four chapters, and now we're looking at a section we've entitled Proclaiming the Kingdom, which lasts up through the middle of chapter 16. Under the heading of Proclaiming the Kingdom, we've already discussed the beginning of the Galilean ministry, the Sermon on the Mount, miracles of healing, and now we're in a section we've entitled Sending Forth the 12. This section will conclude at the end of chapter 12. We've already discussed topics concerning sending forth the 12 in chapter 9 and chapter 10, in chapter 11, and now we'll begin chapter 12 by looking at these topics: breaking the Sabbath law, the claim of human need, the master of the Sabbath, love and law, the challenge accepted, characteristics of the servant of the Lord, and Satan's defenses are breached. Let's give chapter 12 a quick overview before we get into our reading and our discussion. A crisis has come. In this chapter, we will see a series of events that will lead the Jews to believe the only way to truly be done with Jesus is to have him killed. Let's look at four stages of growth in the hatred of the scribes and Pharisees. In the first 8 verses, we see the story of the disciples plucking ears of corn on the Sabbath, and we notice growing suspicion. The Jews wonder, how could a teacher allow his disciples to break the Sabbath law? In verses 9 through 14, in the story of Jesus healing the man with the paralyzed hand on the Sabbath, we see what we'll call active and hostile investigation. You might want to take a look at Luke 6:7. It tells us that the Jews were in the synagogue that day to keep an eye on Jesus. In verses 22 through 32, Jesus is charged by the Orthodox leaders with healing by the power of the devil. In this story, we see their deliberate and prejudiced blindness. And then from verse 14, we see that they were willing to have him killed. They were prepared to act with what Barclay calls evil determination. Let me suggest 5 ways Jesus met this growing opposition. First of all, he met it with courageous defiance. In the case of the man with the paralyzed hand, he deliberately defied the Jewish leaders. He met the opposition with warning. In verses 22 through 32, he warns them that they are on a path of personal spiritual destruction. He answers the opposition with a series of staggering claims. He claims he's greater than the temple, he's greater than Jonah, he's greater than Solomon, he's greater than any other occurrence in spiritual history. He met the growing opposition with the claim that his teaching was essential. We'll see in verses 43 and 45 in the next lesson that he uses the parable of the empty house to demonstrate why his gospel is more efficient than the law. And then, fifthly, he meets the growing opposition with an invitation. We'll see in the next lesson, verses 46 through 50, that he invites everyone to become his kin. He suggests that everyone abandon prejudices and self-will, accept Jesus as the Master and Lord. To refuse to do this is to drift further and further away from God. Before we go any further, let's get our Bibles out and let's read the first 29 verses of chapter 12. And once again, I'm reading from the English Standard Version. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." And he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priest? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." He went on from there and entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" so that they might accuse him. He said to them, "Which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand," and the man stretched it out, and it was restored healthy like the others. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him how to destroy him. Jesus, aware of this, withdrew from there, and many followed him, and he healed them all, and ordered them not to make him known. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. "Behold, my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not quench, until he brings justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will hope." Then a demon-oppressed man who was blind and mute was brought to him, and he healed him, so that the man spoke and saw. And all the people were amazed and said, "Can this be the Son of David?" But when the Pharisees heard it, they said, "It is only by Beelzebul, the prince of demons, that this man casts out demons." Knowing their thoughts, he said to them, "Every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and no city or house divided against itself will stand. And if Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then will the kingdom stand? If I cast out demons by Beelzebul, by whom do your sons cast them out? Therefore they will be your judges. But if it is by the Spirit of God that I cast out demons, then the kingdom of God is come upon you. Or how can someone enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods, unless he first binds that strong man? Then indeed he may plunder his house." Let's go back and think about verses 1 through 8 for a few minutes. The disciples are not charged with stealing because Jewish law permitted a traveler to eat from the fields along the road. That was perfectly legal. The problem, as the scribes and Pharisees saw it, was that it was done on the Sabbath day. Let me share with you something from Barclay. The commandment forbids work on the Sabbath day, but the interpreters of the law were not satisfied with that simple prohibition. Work had to be defined. So 39 basic actions were laid down which were forbidden on the Sabbath, and amongst them were reaping, winnowing, and threshing, and preparing a meal. The interpreters were not even prepared to leave the matter there. Each item in the list of forbidden works had to be carefully defined. For instance, it was forbidden to carry a burden. But what is a burden? A burden is anything which weighs as much as 2 dried figs. Even the suggestion of work was forbidden. Even anything which might symbolically be regarded as work was prohibited. Later, one of the great Jewish teachers said this: "To pluck ears is a kind of reaping." By their conduct, the disciples were guilty of far more than one breach of the law. By plucking the corn, they were guilty of reaping. By rubbing it in their hands, they were guilty of threshing. By separating the grain and chaff, they were guilty of winnowing. And by the whole process, they were guilty of preparing a meal on the Sabbath day. For everything which was to be eaten on the Sabbath was to be prepared the previous day. So this is why the disciples and Jesus were in trouble with the scribes and Pharisees, not because of the commandment to do no work on the Sabbath, but because of the scribes and Pharisees' interpretation of that law. In the eyes of the scribes and Pharisees, the law had been 3 times broken by each disciple that ate of this grain. As we continue our thoughts on the first 8 verses, let's think about the claim of human need. Jesus argued that David and his men ate the showbread from the tabernacle, which was wrong. You can take a moment and go look at 1 Samuel 21 and Leviticus 24. Now, is Jesus teaching that human need outweighed the law? Absolutely not, but he was pointing out that David, who was a hero of the Pharisees, made decisions that the Pharisees would be unwilling to condemn. While they were willing to condemn Jesus, they would probably never condemn the acts of their hero, David. On the Sabbath, there was work that had to be done in the temple. So the rules of the Sabbath were not absolute for everyone. Fires were lit, animals were slaughtered and lifted onto the altar, all violations of the Sabbath law. And these actions were permitted for the priest to carry out. Worship offered to God took precedence over Sabbath rules and regulations. Jesus quotes from Hosea 6, verse 6, and he says basically that kindness outweighs ritual. I want to share a poem with you today, and this is I'm pretty sure from John Greenleaf Whittier. The poem goes this way. O brother man, fold to thy heart thy brother. Where pity dwells, the peace of God is there. To worship rightly is to love each other, each smile a hymn, each kindly deed a prayer. For he whom Jesus loved hath truly spoken, the holier worship which he deigns to bless. Restores the lost, and binds the spirit broken, and feeds the widow and the fatherless. Follow him with reverent steps, the great example of him whose holy work was doing good. So shall the wide earth seem our Father's temple, each loving life a psalm of gratitude. This is really what we mean, or ought to mean, when we say, let us go to worship God. A few more thoughts on the first 8 verses before we leave them. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, Jesus said. Well, here's the question. Is Jesus claiming that as Lord of the Sabbath, he could do as he saw fit on that day? Or is he telling them that if anyone knows the Sabbath law, it is Jesus, not them? I probably think the answer is the latter. Or is Jesus instead claiming that in defense of the disciples, that human need outweighs Sabbath ritual? I'm going to let you go look at Mark 2:27 and come back and consider these questions and see if you have a preferable answer. Let me know in the comments below if you do. Now let's move on. Let's look at verses 9 through 14 for a few minutes. The Orthodox Jew would literally rather die than break the Sabbath law. Other nations use this against the Jews by attacking them when, of course, on the Sabbath days. Well, was the law broken by Jesus in this case? When he healed this man, it only allowed bare minimum medical treatment on the Sabbath. Let's say a few more things about this before we make up our mind. The law did allow a man to remove his animal from a pit or ditch on the Sabbath. Jesus says, is a man more valuable than a sheep? Or is a sheep more valuable than a man? It's a rhetorical question. Of course, a man is more valuable than a sheep. If doing good on the Sabbath is allowed, then to not do good on the Sabbath would be evil. Jesus healed the man, and in doing so, he gave the man three things. One, he gave him back his health. Are the healing practices from God? Even today, some will not seek a doctor's help, they say, for religious reasons. And yet, Jesus healed. He practiced healing. So he gave the man back his health. Secondly, he gave him back his work. Whatever this man needed to do in his life was going to be hindered by this withered hand. But thirdly, he gave him also back his self-respect. Some commentators have suggested that this incident is a turning point in Jesus' ministry. The fact that the scribes and Pharisees began to persecute Christ showed that they regarded him as not only dangerous to their cause, but they regarded him as being very effective in his work. Ponder that for just a moment. Let's look into verses 15 through 21. Jesus never confused courage with recklessness. For the time being, he withdrew from the crowds, and he prohibited men from surrounding him with publicity. Why do you think that's so? I've come to the conclusion that he was trying to forestall a political rebellion. Other commentators have other ideas. Check your favorite commentary on Matthew and see what that person has to say. In Isaiah 42, verses 1 through 4, we know that this prophecy originally applied to Cyrus, but here Matthew tells us it was also messianic in nature. Let's talk about how this prophecy from Isaiah applied to Jesus in the first century. Number one, he will tell the nations what justice is. Justice, which means giving to God and men their due. We must live so both God and men receive their proper place in our lives. Secondly, he will not strive, cry aloud, or let his voice be heard in the streets. He would not brawl, either verbally or physically, with the crowds. There will be no semblance of what we call a modern debate. He will not break the crushed reed nor quench the smoking wick. That means he came to encourage people, to not discourage people. And in the end, not only will his teachings be for the Jews, but the Gentiles will have hope in him as well. In Matthew, we see 4 clauses that give us a glimpse of a God's eye view of Christ. One, God's servant. We'll talk about this more when we study chapter 20, verses 20 through 28. Secondly, Matthew talks about Jesus as being God's chosen, God's beloved, one in whom God is well pleased. Look back at our discussion on chapter 3, verse 17, and you can look forward into chapter 17, verse 6 as well. So these are characteristics of the servant of the Lord. Now we'll finish up our study for this part 1 of 2 by looking at verses 22 through 29. Satan's defenses are breached. In Bible times, the Eastern world ascribed all illnesses to the demons. Exorcism was commonly practiced and apparently frequently successful. Perhaps without miraculous intervention, no, but only because the patient thought the cure was effective. In other words, what we call a psychosomatic illness. But perhaps not. Could Jesus be the son of David? Why were the people so skeptical? Well, we know why the scribes and Pharisees were skeptical. They charged that Jesus is in league with the devil. Jesus answers them back. He says, if the kingdom was casting out demons by, if he, that is, in his kingdom was casting out demons by Satan's power, then the demonic kingdom was split, and dissension within brings power to a standstill. Now we're going to skip the second reason, which we'll come back to in our next study, and let's go to the third. So we skip his second answer, we go to the third. If I am casting out demons, then I have invaded Satan's own domain, which must mean he is bound or he would not allow it. See Isaiah 49:24 through 26. Well, when was Satan bound? We know at his temptation, it appears that Satan was bound. But here's the thing. Is Satan still running his organization from prison? We know that he is. Chumbley said this: hypocrites tend to criticize those outside their circle, while ignoring similar behavior and practices within their own clique. All right, that's all the time we have for this lesson. We're going to come back and talk about verses 22 through 29 at the beginning of our next video. Thank you so much for watching. I sure appreciate it. I would appreciate you liking this video, subscribing to this channel, hitting the notification bell, and making a comment. Until next time, may God bless.